Morning, Forward Church. Get to start off this morning with one of the joys of being a pastor. I get to announce the marriage today between Noah Michael Gitchlar of Cambridge, Ontario, and Marissa Adrienne McDonald of Cambridge, Ontario. The wedding is to take place, Lord willing, on Saturday, August 3rd, 2024, in the township of South Dumfries, Ontario. And we just want to extend God's richest blessings to Noah and Marissa on their wedding day as that approaches. I'm going to ask you to turn in your Bibles this morning to Matthew chapter 14, verse 13. If you're using one of the Bibles that is under some of the chairs that are located here, the page is 869. If it's your first time with us, or maybe it's your first time in a while, we are in this series that we have called Sunday School Unfiltered. And if you grew up in and around church, these are probably some stories as we walk through the summer that are going to be familiar to you. And if you are not used to being in church, maybe this is your first time ever in church. First of all, we're so happy you're here. Second, these are some great stories for you to know that help us to understand and that help to anchor our faith. And so today's story that we're going to enter into and explore is commonly known as the feeding of the 5,000. It is one of only 2 episodes in Jesus' life that is captured in all 4 of the Gospels, all 4 of the accounts of Jesus' life. Only the feeding of the 5,000 and the resurrection are found in every single gospel. And what I want to start by doing is I just want to give you like a quick outline of this story as I heard it on a number of occasions when I was in children's church and Sunday school growing up, or midweek kids ministry. So here's the story. Jesus and his disciples have been really busy doing ministry, and they have decided to withdraw into the countryside to get a little rest. But when they get there, the problem is people hear that Jesus is there. They've heard about all of the miracles and healings that he's been doing, and this huge crowd of people from all the surrounding towns and villages shows up and meets them there. So Jesus, being Jesus, looks, and instead of sending them all home, it says he has compassion on them. That his heart is moved. It's stirred towards the people who have showed up. And so he begins teaching, and he begins healing, and he begins doing miracles. And it's a long day of ministry. And as the day goes on and kind of draws to an end, the disciples say to Jesus, "Hey, you think maybe it's time to send all these people home? Because they got to eat. And I don't know where they're going to get any food around here, so Jesus, just send them back and let's call it a day. I mean, we were coming out here to rest in the first place." And then Jesus says to them, No. We don't need to send them away. You give them something to eat. And so the disciples kind of look at one another. They look over at Jesus. They look back at one another and say, "Jesus, do you realize how many people there are? We didn't even bring enough food for 50 of them, let alone 5,000, let alone 15,000 of them." And Jesus says, "Well, why don't you just go around, check out in the crowd, see what's available. You know, go canvass the crowd. Maybe we can pull together a really good potluck dinner." And so they go around and they're looking. They come back. And the disciples realize all they have is 5 little loaves and 2 fishes. And I bet you it says that Andrew is the one that had to go to Jesus. Now, Andrew is Peter's brother. And I bet you Peter said to Andrew, "Man, I'm always the one saying stupid things to Jesus. Andrew, it's your turn." And so Andrew goes up and he says, "Well, we canvassed the crowd, and we found this little boy, and he had 5 loaves and 2 fishes. Look at him, Jesus. Here he is with his 5 loaves and 2 fishes. That's all we got. Maybe now we should send them home." And Jesus says to them, "No, here's what I want you to do. I want you to get everybody to begin to sit down, because I'm going to take these 5 loaves and 2 fishes and feed everybody who's here. And so everybody gets sat down. The disciples sit them down. They take the 5 loaves and 2 fishes. Jesus begins breaking them. And they have so much food that they don't just give a little bit of food to everybody who's there. They feed everybody, it says, until they were fully satisfied. And there were 12 baskets of leftovers at the end. And that's how I heard the story growing up. And that's a great account of the story. One of the reasons why we like to tell stories, or why people tell stories, and why stories are so effective, is because we put ourselves into the story. We identify with the characters, right? So they become really sticky to us. Now, you know this because if you've ever gone to a Batman movie, all young children and most adult men come out of the movie saying, "I'm Batman." Right? We identify with characters in the story. The question I want to ask you is, what character do you think I identified with as a kid? Anybody? I identify with the little boy because I was a little boy, right? There's a little boy. He's got 5 loaves and 2 fishes. And so when I heard this story, the way I received it was sharing is good, right? It's good to share. Now, I just want to say ahead of time, I am pro-sharing. If there's kids in the crowd, sharing is good. But that's not the point of the story. That's not the point of the story. Today, what I want us to do is, I want us to put ourselves in the shoes, in the feet, in the sandals of the disciples. And so, let me read the actual account from the Gospel of Matthew to you, found in Matthew 14, 13, 21, one of the 4 accounts. And then, as I'm doing this, I just want you to put yourself in the place of the disciples. So let's start in. Matthew 14, 13 says, when Jesus heard about it. Now, I don't want to just skip over this because you have to ask, what is it? What is Jesus hearing about? The it here is found directly ahead of it. The it here is the murder of John the Baptist. It is the murder of a friend and family member of Jesus. So he heard about it. He heard about John's death by Herod, his execution. And he withdrew from there by a boat to a remote place to be alone. When the crowds heard this, they followed him on foot from the towns. When he went ashore, he saw a large crowd and had compassion on them, and he healed their sick. When evening came, the disciples approached him and said, "This place is deserted and it's already late. Send the crowds away so that they can go into the villages and buy food for themselves." This is Jesus. It's been a long day. We are tired. We came out here to get away. Not only are we tired, we're grieving. Our hearts are broken. Like, we've gone with you to this point, but I think maybe it's time to just send everybody home for the day. Jesus said, they don't need to go away, Jesus told them. You give them something to eat. But we only have 5 loaves and 2 fishes here, they said to him. Again, the disciples are here. They're spent. Have you ever been in that spot where you're just spent? You don't have anything more to give. I think that's where the disciples were. I mean, I think not only were they grieving, they were probably a little scared for themselves. I mean, we can actually get that out of the text that comes ahead, because it says that Herod has now begun to pay attention to Jesus. He thinks Jesus is John the Baptist resurrected, come back from the grave. And if that's what happened to John, what's going to happen to Jesus when Herod starts to pay attention to them? What's going to happen to us? And so they're tired, they're scared, they're worn out, and Jesus says, hey, here's what I want you to do. You got a bunch of people, thousands of people in front of you. I want you to feed them. Now, imagine you came home from a long, long day. Maybe it's a long day of looking after kids. Maybe it's a long day at work. And your spouse says, oh, I just want to let you know, everyone from work is coming over for supper tonight. And I just thought maybe you could whip something up for them. And you're like, well, what am I going to feed them with? Oh, just don't worry about it. Just go look in the cupboard, see what we've got. And you look in the cupboard. You know, you got 2 cans of tuna fish and 6 stale hot dogs that expired on July 16th. 5 stale hot dog buns, 6 stale hot dog buns. I didn't count right. Imagine that that's what you've got. You come out, you say, oh, I've got 5 stale hot dog buns and 2 cans of tuna. How many people are coming over? Well, see, I think we got about 50 people who work at work. They're all planning on coming. And I said if you wanted to, you can bring your families. Right? Because what's going on here is that Jesus is asking them to feed, we call it the feeding of the 5,000. He's actually probably asking them to feed about 15 to 20,000 people. Because the text says there were about 5,000 men besides women and children. So most commentators would say there's probably 15 to 20,000 people that their 2 cans of tuna and 5 stale hot dog buns are supposed to feed now. Put yourself in that spot. Imagine yourself being as the disciples were. Verse 18, it says, Jesus said, bring them here to me. Then he commanded the crowds to sit down on the grass, and he took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he blessed them. That is, he blessed the food that he was about to offer up to the Father in order to have it multiplied. And so he broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowds. Everyone ate and was satisfied, and they picked up 12 baskets full of leftover pieces. See, this is not ultimately a story about the power of sharing, although sharing is important. It's a story of being obedient when Jesus asks us to do something, even something that seems crazy and impossible. It's a story of being obedient even when you don't want to be, even when you don't feel like it. It's a story of walking in obedience even when you think this is a stupid plan. It's a story of when we walk in obedience, how Jesus makes the impossible possible. And it's a story about how walking in obedience is ultimately the way to walk into full satisfaction in life. And so I just want to unpack this a little bit for the rest of our time this morning and apply these realities to us. First, here's the first thing I need us to know. Jesus is calling us to obey him even when what he asks you to do seems crazy. Jesus is calling us to obey him even when what he asks us to do just seems crazy to us. The disciples have no access to food. There's none around. This is what they have, plus 15 to 20,000 hungry people who need to be fed. And even if they had food, we read in the accounts, even if there was food available to be bought, they didn't have money for it. It would cost more than 8 months of wages to pay to cover everybody for food today. And we still wouldn't have enough. Jesus was asking them to do what for them was absolutely impossible. Not possible. They did not have the resources for what God was asking them to do, what Jesus was asking them to do. And maybe that's the spot you're in today. Like, you've been wrestling with Jesus because Jesus is calling you to do something, and you're like, I don't have the resources to do this. I don't have the ability, the capability to do this. God, I can't give financially. I don't have enough to be able to trust you with anything. I need to rely on this. God, forgiveness and reconciliation, I'm tapped out. I don't have the resources to forgive anymore. I'm done. You want me to have a difficult conversation with someone who isn't walking in the way of Jesus but claims to be a follower of Jesus? I mean, listen, who am I to judge? Like, I mess up all the time. I can't do this. I know my own failings and flaws. Jesus, this is not a thing that I can step into. You want me to share the gospel with that person? I don't have the training. I don't have the words. I don't have the capability to do that. You calling me to serve? I don't have any skills. I don't have any abilities. I don't have the time. I can't serve. I can't serve in church. I can't serve in my neighborhood. I don't have it in me to give. Maybe he's calling you to move in to a new place, a new neighborhood, a new situation. And you're like, me there? No. Or maybe he's calling you to move out. Maybe he's asking you to leave something. And you're like, I can't leave. If I leave that, I'm done. Maybe he's calling you to change jobs. He's calling you to think missionally about your life and where you will invest the hours and times and minutes that he gives you. And I'm just telling you, if you're going to fully, truly follow Jesus, he's going to ask you to do some crazy things. He's going to ask you to do some things that to you feel impossible, that you just can't do on your own. And if everything that you have ever done in the name of Jesus makes total and complete sense, seems totally rational to all the people around you who don't follow Jesus, I would suggest to you that you probably haven't been fully following Jesus. See, he calls us to do crazy things at times, things that don't make sense from our perspective, things that we feel we couldn't do because we couldn't do them. We can't do them, not without him. I'm telling you this as somebody who has learned this lesson over and over again, who has had Jesus call him into crazy stuff over and over again. When I first felt Jesus call into ministry, I was like, absolutely no way. God, I hate being in the center of attention. And I can't speak. I stutter. I fall all over my words. Nobody's going to listen to me. You got the wrong kid. And Jesus said, listen, it's not about you. It's about me. Do what I'm asking you to do. When Amanda and I first decided to start a family, we were both on temporary contracts, about to be unemployed. We had no idea what was next, and yet we just felt God saying, okay, it's time to start your family. It's time to have some kids, and God provided. He showed up. When I started at the last church that I was at before I came to Forward in Oakville, I was 6 months in, and I realized this children's ministry space is terrible. I hope somebody's going to do something about this. And God said, yeah, you're going to do something about this. I said, I don't even know the difference between a flathead screwdriver and a Phillips screwdriver. What am I going to do, God? And every single time that God called me into something crazy, something that was impossible for me, he met me there and did what was necessary. Because here's the thing. Obedience is the evidence of faith. I remember being a dad when my kids were little and teaching them to swim, and you get them to jump in the pool into your arms, right? And that's a bit of a crazy thing when you're a kid. You're like, I can't swim. If somebody doesn't catch me, I'm going down to the bottom of the pool and I'm done. Then the reason kids jump in and into your arms is because my kids all jump because they trusted me. They trusted that Dad would be there to catch them if he said jump. Now, I could catch them when they were little. That was a good trust bet. If today I told my son to go on the roof and I sat down underneath and I said, Luke, jump, I'll catch you. I hope he would be smart enough, although he is a 16-year-old boy, so there's caveats to this, to realize this is not going to end well for him or Dad. Right? the obedience to the command to jump ought to be based in the resources of the person who is commanding it to do what is necessary when they call you to it. And here's the thing with Jesus. He has all the resources in the world. He's the one who speaks and the world comes into existence. The universe comes into existence. Feeding 15,000 people with 5 loaves and 2 fishes, nothing for him. He spoke those fish into existence in the first place. Do you trust enough in Jesus to meet you and supply all your needs when he calls you into something? That's really the question. That's the thing that we have to grapple with, is how much do I trust the one who is calling to me? Now, some of you, here's the thing. Some of us get real pumped up about a message like this. We're gonna go take hell with a squirt gun for Jesus. Some of you, the thing Jesus is going to ask you to do is not something big and great and glorious for him. 1 Thessalonians 4:11-12, Paul says to the Thessalonians, to the believers in Thessalonica, seek to lead a quiet life, to mind your own business, to work with your hands as we commanded you, so that you may behave properly in the presence of outsiders, so you may reflect Jesus well in the places that I have placed you and not be dependent on anyone. Right? Sometimes the thing that we don't want to do is just live quiet, submitted, humble lives. We want to be a big thing. But it's not about us being a big thing. It's about the fact that Jesus is the big thing. Obey Jesus. Whether he's asking you to feed 15,000 people with 5 loaves and 2 fishes, or whether he's asking you to serve in a ministry that you feel woefully unprepared for, unready for, or whether he's called you to live a life of quiet submission and obedience to him by being a light to those he places around you. Obey him even if what he seems to be calling you to do seems impossible and crazy. Also, obey Jesus even when you think you got a better plan. See, if I put myself in the story, if I'm there and I'm one of the disciples and we put this thing up to a vote, option number 1, we send everybody home for dinner. Option number 2, we go with Jesus' plan and feed all these people with nothing. I vote option number 1. Send them home. Like, if we're voting on plans, that's where I am, in my flesh, on my own. But here's the thing. At the end of the day, Jesus' plan was better. And that's because Jesus knew what the disciples didn't know. If you flip over to John's account in John 6:6, it says, as he asked him to do these things, he himself knew what he was going to do. He himself knew what he was going to do. Oftentimes, I've found in my life, and maybe this is true for your life as well, Jesus calls me to do something, and instead of obedience, I offer him information. You ever find yourself doing that? Like, that's what the disciples did, right? Feed them. Jesus, are you aware that we don't have anything to feed them with? And even if we could buy it, we don't have money for it. Like, did you know that, Jesus? And Jesus is like, I don't need your information here. You don't, Jesus, like, okay, I understand that you don't really want me to have sex outside of marriage. You know how hard that is? Like, I've even been married before. Now I'm dating this person. Like, surely there's an exemption for me. You want me to only marry another Christian. Have you seen the dating pool? It's limited. Maybe we could make some exceptions here. I think I've got a different plan. This guy that I work with, phenomenal. He'll make a great Christian someday if he ever comes around to it. You want me to be what? You want me to be faithful to my marriage vows? Do you know the person I got married to? This is hard. God, I hear you. about the idea of going overseas for missions. But I also have noticed there are a lot of people around here that don't know Jesus. So maybe we could do that thing instead. Or sometimes instead of him getting our obedience, we give him our advice, right? So they say, hey, Jesus. Option B, we send them home. That could be a good plan too. Hey, Jesus, I know that you want me to share the gospel with people around me, like personally share the gospel, but I thought my pastor is better at that than me. So maybe we could do this thing where I bring them to the pastor instead, and he can do it. I know that you say, love your enemies. And I think, in theory, this is a good plan. But my enemies it might be better for them if we destroyed my enemies. Or at least got them to go far, far away so I never had to see them again. That could be a good plan too, right? Whole bunch of times, instead of obeying Jesus, what we tend to do is we disregard Jesus because we think that we have a better plan than Jesus. That's what disobedience is at its core every single time. I have a better plan than you. We'll do my thing instead of your thing. But here's the thing. You can trust Jesus because he knows more than you. And it means that his plan is better than your plan every single time. Never once have you had a plan and Jesus had a plan and your plan was better than his. Not once. The reason he told them what they needed to do, that they needed to go feed them, is because he already knew what he was going to do. If he's calling you to do something, he doesn't need your information. He's not lacking a vital piece of information that would change the plan. He's got all the information in the world, including the information that you don't currently have. He doesn't need your advice. And he certainly doesn't need you to take his advice take his commands as just advice. Jesus doesn't offer suggestions. He gives us commands. What he needs from us is our obedience. So obey him, even when it seems crazy. Obey him, even when you think you've got the better plan. And lastly, obey Jesus even when you don't feel like it. I think the disciples were sitting there thinking, I can't believe you're going to ask this of us now. After everything that's been going on, they had been out. Now, Jesus had heard about John the Baptist. They had been out in some really intense ministry. We find out in a couple of the other passages. And they themselves are just exhausted from the ministry that God had sent them out to, or Jesus had sent them out to do. And so here they are, and they're ready for their rest. And I'm sure they thought to themselves, we came out here to rest. Now we've ministered to these people all day. Surely that was enough, Lord. Now you're going to call us to feed these people on top of it? It's a bit much. How could you ask this of us? You ever feel that way sometimes when Jesus asks you to do something? I mean, I'll put my hand up. The times where I'm like, you have to be kidding me. This phone call now, after the day that I've had already, I don't have it in me. I'm done. I'm spent. And deep down, we start asking ourselves the question, how could you ask me to do this and still care about me? Do you actually care about me, or do you just want me to do things for you? Because Jesus, this is going to cost me. This is going to be hard. Sometimes I think we think that Jesus calls us to do the impossible. We start to feel like it's because he's indifferent. He doesn't really care about us. But here's what I want you to know this morning. You can trust him because he loves you. Do you notice in verse 14 what we see about Jesus? His character. When he went ashore, he saw a large crowd and had compassion on them. Always and at all times, at the heart of God and all that he asks of you and me is this reality: he loves us. John 15:9 said, Jesus says, as the Father has loved me, so I love you. And that's not just inclusive of the disciples who are in front of him, that is inclusive of all his disciples in all ages at all times. I think Jesus knows here that his disciples are tired. He knows that they are worn out, but he knows that they need something even more than rest. They need their faith to be built up and strengthened. Listen, did Jesus actually need the disciples to do anything to help feed this crowd? No, it's a simple. Andrea answered that question in her testimony. She came to a point where God doesn't need me for anything. God does not call you to obedience. He doesn't command you to do things because he needs anything from you. He does it because he wants something for you. He wants you to grow. He wants to strengthen you. He wants to mature you. He wants you to see his glory and his grandeur and his goodness in your life. He wants to give you purpose. He wants to bless others through you. In that way, you will be blessed. He wants to keep you from things that would keep you from him. He wants to grow you in understanding the same things that the disciples needed to understand here. Two things. First, that with Jesus, the impossible is possible. If God is calling you to do what seems beyond you today, here's what you really need to know. What's impossible for you? The forgiveness that's impossible for you. The ask that's impossible for you. The obedience that's impossible for you. What's impossible for you when it's you and Jesus is no longer impossible? Your resources are limited, but God's resources are unlimited. I can't forgive. No, on your own, you will run out of the capacity to forgive. But because Christ has forgiven you in an unlimited fashion, you never run out of the resources to forgive others because you draw on the resources of Christ to forgive others. I don't have the ability. You probably don't. But that's okay because Jesus is more than enough. And if he calls you into something, he will equip you for that thing. Where would I find the money? How about the guy who speaks the universe into existence? He's a good guy to go to. There's a simple equation that you and I need to remember. Take whatever you have, your stale buns and your tuna fish, place it into Jesus' hands. It always equals more than enough. That's what we need to remember. The other thing that he wants them to know is that only walking in obedience to him ultimately satisfies. See, if you're weighing out right now whether to trust Jesus or not, whether to follow him or not, if you're worried his plan won't be as good as your plan, listen to how this story ends. He took the 5 loaves and the 2 fishes, and he looked up to heaven. He blessed them. He broke the loaves. He gave them to the disciples. The disciples gave them to the crowds. Everyone ate, and not just a little bit. They ate till their tummies were overflowing so much that nobody could eat anymore, and there were 12 baskets of leftovers at the end. Jesus always and forever satisfies. Some of you today, you're in a spot, and you know this, where you have been holding back on Jesus because you're not sure that you can trust him. You've been holding back on making him the center of your life, in allowing him to lead you in all areas. There are areas of your life that are not in alignment with him, and it fundamentally comes down to, do you trust him? Do you believe that even if he calls you into crazy things, what is impossible with you is possible with him? Do you believe that his plan is better than your plan? Do you believe that even though you feel like maybe that thing that he's calling you to do is a matter of indifference, that he doesn't care about you, do you actually believe that deep down in your soul, Jesus loves you and he'll never call you to do something that isn't for your best and for his glory? I want you to close your eyes for a second. I want you to think about an area in your life right now where God is calling you into something. He's calling you to obedience. It could be an area of your life where you know you are walking in sin and disobedience, and you need to turn from that and walk in obedience to him. Might be something that he's been prompting you to step into that you've been resisting. Do you believe that with Jesus the impossible is possible? Do you believe that he can meet all your needs no matter how big they are? He doesn't need what you have. He wants to invite you in because he wants you, not what you've got. Do you believe right now that he knows more than you know? And that whatever he's going to lead you into do is ultimately for your best because he loves you? Then trust those things into his hand today. For some of you, it starts with this. You have never come to a point where you have placed your faith in Jesus for your salvation, for your final and ultimate satisfaction. You have entrusted that Jesus is all you need. You're pursuing other things other than Jesus. You have entrusted that Jesus alone is sufficient to pay the penalty for your sin, and that the fact that he rose from the dead proves that your sin can be forgiven in him. Today, would you place yourself in a spot where you would come under submission to Jesus? Would you surrender to him? Would you trust him with your life and decide to follow him today? Because if you call out to him, the Word of God says if we confess with our mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in our hearts that God raised him from the dead, we will be saved. Today, you can know that you belong to Jesus if you trust him, and that come what may, nothing can separate you from him. Let me just leave you with this. Wherever you're at today, whatever's going on in your life, Jesus is all that you need, because whenever you have Jesus, you always have more than enough. Let me pray. God, thank you for this account. We call it a story, but Father, this is a real reality that you did. That Jesus took 5 loaves and 2 fishes that were offered up to him in obedience, first by a little boy and then by the disciples in their willingness, no matter how resistant they may have been at points, no matter how fearful they may have been, their faith to walk in obedience. You then took that and multiplied it out so it was enough to satisfy. God, for those who are here today and they are wondering whether you can be trusted, would they look at Jesus and seeing the fullness of you in him, would they know that you know more than they know and that you love them deeply and unconditionally? Father, help us to trust you in all things, that we would be surrendered and abandoned to you, knowing that in Jesus we have more than enough. Amen.